I am Keth Avon, third-tier archival clerk of the Vehn Territorial Survey Commission, and I will tell you what the file said. I will tell you what I added to it. I will tell you, at the end, what I could not bring myself to write in the official record, what I wrote instead, which is a thing clerks do when the facts exceed the form, when the standard fields offer 12 options and none of them are correct. This file required that kind of writing. The file began, as most of my files begin, with a contract. Contracts are clean. They have parties and terms and a compensation schedule, and when I receive them, they have already been executed, which means the interesting part is over and I am only there to confirm the shape of what happened. I do not make decisions. I record them. I do not escalate. I do not investigate. I note what is noted and I route what requires routing, and at the end of the day, I have a complete file or I have a file in progress, and either way the file is a bounded thing, a shape with edges, and my job is to trace the edges until they close. I have done this for 19 years. I have closed several thousand files. I have read things that required careful reading and filed things that required careful classification. And in the process, I have developed what I believe to be a reliable sense of what a file is going to be before I have finished reading its first section. Most files tell you what they are immediately. The form, the originating office, the parties involved, the transaction type. These things project the file's character with considerable accuracy. This file told me it was a standard outer margin disposal contract. It was not that. It was the opposite of that, in ways I am still working out, in ways that I do not believe have a standard field to contain them. Let me begin with the Sovath Hydrological Corridor. The corridor is a gorge system on the planet Sovath, which sits in the outer margin of Vehn territorial jurisdiction, far enough from the core worlds that the Survey Commission's enforcement presence is thin, and thin enough that certain classes of private contractor have learned to treat the margin as a space where the Commission's interest arrives slowly, if it arrives at all. The planet is tidally influenced by a large companion body in a way that affects its hydrological cycles significantly. The wet season runs 8 of the planet's 11-month year, and during the wet season the Sovath corridor is not, strictly speaking, navigable in any sense that the word navigable usually carries. The corridor runs for approximately 600 kilometers through the equatorial uplift zone, fed by 4 major river branches, and an uncountable number of seasonal tributaries that drain from the plateau systems above. The walls of the corridor in its central section rise between 300 and 500 meters from the water surface. The basalt substrate is of a type the Commission's geologists describe as highly fractured, with irregular shelf formation at variable elevations above the waterline, which means, translated out of geological language, that there are surfaces above the water that are not walls and not floor, and are sometimes navigable and sometimes not, depending on the season and the water level and the nature of the basalt itself, which the Commission's assessment describes as sharp-edged, with minimal surface weathering due to the periodic inundation cycle. The water in the central channel runs at depths between 12 and 40 meters depending on the season, over that fractured basalt bed, at current speeds that the Commission's standard assessment instrument characterized as incompatible with standard biological transit. I have processed files for 19 years, and I have seen the Commission's assessment language in many contexts, and incompatible with standard biological transit is a phrase I had not seen before this file. The standard language for difficult water is presents significant hazard to unassisted transit, or, at the upper end of the scale, is not recommended for surface-level biological passage. Incompatible is a different word. It is the word you use when you mean that something is not difficult but is, in the literal sense of the term, not possible. Not possible, full stop. The Commission had classified the Sovath corridor as a Category 18 environmental hazard 7 years before the events I am recording. The assessment that produced the Category 18 designation was conducted by a 6-person team using a survey vessel, without any personnel entering the water or the corridor walls at any point. The assessment team had logged, in their field notes, an annotation that I found when I pulled the original survey record. Direct assessment of the corridor interior is not feasible under current operational parameters. Classification is based on remote instrument data and the corridor's documented prior casualty record. The corridor's documented prior casualty record. 31 expeditions had entered the Sovath corridor since the Commission's first formal survey attempt, 42 years before the events of this file. I assembled this history in the file's background section, and I will summarize it here because I think it is important context for everything that comes after. 6 of the 31 expeditions were Commission-sanctioned scientific surveys. 12 were commercial extraction ventures, prospecting the basalt shelf mineral deposits that satellite imaging had flagged as potentially significant. 8 were private adventure contractors, the kind of firm that sells clients the experience of lethal environments under the understanding that the lethality is, in practice, managed, and that management means something. 5 were unclassified entries with no sponsoring entity on record, which is a category I have always found more honest than the others, because at least those people did not pretend to have a plan. All 31 expeditions were lost. Not partially lost, not lost with survivors who were recovered downstream. Lost in the complete sense. Teams entered the Sovath corridor, their tracking and communication signals ceased, and the Commission's recovery teams, who were professionals doing difficult and dangerous work in a system that, I will note, did not discriminate between the people it was sent to find and the people it was sent to retrieve them, found what remained, eventually, in the sediment accumulations of the corridor's lower drainage mouth, in the collection zone that the recovery teams had taken to calling. In the informal shorthand that develops among people who do a terrible job over a long time, the archive. The archive was where the Sovath corridor kept its records. 31 expeditions over 42 years. 0 recovery of living personnel. Every classification from scientific survey team to commercial extraction crew to adventure contractor to unknown individual. The corridor consumed them all with what I can only describe as indifference to the distinction. The Commission had, after the 18th loss, quietly reclassified the corridor as Category 20 on its internal working documents, while maintaining the public Category 18 designation because, and I found this notation in the internal document itself, written by whoever made the decision, formal reclassification to Category 20 requires interagency review and would generate questions regarding the delay in reclassification relative to the documented loss record. They had known. They had known the public designation was wrong, and they had maintained it, because correcting it would require explaining why it had been wrong for as long as it had been wrong. I noted this in the file's background section. I noted it precisely, with the correct document references, which is the thing you do when you are a clerk and you find something that should not be there. The Thurvec reclamation crew entered this file on the 4th day of the 6th month, when their engagement contract was logged with the Commission's outer margin office by their standard administrative representative. The contract described the crew's service as site survey support and personnel transit assistance for independent contractor operations in the Sovath outer zone. This is the language Thurvec used for all their outer margin contracts. I had seen 14 previous Thurvec contracts in my career. I had never looked closely at any of them. They were contracts. Contracts were clean. I had logged them and routed them and not looked further, because looking further was not my function. I looked further at this one. The Thurvec crew consisted of 4 operatives, the crew lead, a pilot, and 2 field technicians. Their transport was a mid-class utility carrier registered under a hull code that the Commission's traffic registry attributed to a decommissioned agricultural freight vessel, a registration that had not been updated in 6 years, which is a violation of Commission Traffic Code, which I noted. They had been operating in the outer margin for at least 6 years, as far back as I could trace their contract record. Their prior contracts, 14 of them, as I said, showed a pattern that I only saw once I assembled them together in a single document and read across rather than down. A client, a remote location, a personnel transit, and then 3 to 4 weeks later, a commission non-recovery filing from the client, describing an expedition member lost to environmental hazard. 11 non-recovery filings, across 14 contracts, processed by 7 different clerks in 4 different regional offices, under 14 different expedition identifiers, each filing standing alone because the clients were different and the locations were different, and there was no field in the Commission's non-recovery form that asked whether the lost expedition member had been placed in the hazardous environment deliberately. I was the 8th clerk. I had been the 8th clerk for 14 of those 14 contracts, which is to say the Thurvec crew's administrative representative had, through either coincidence or careful routing, ensured that their contracts went to my office, where I had logged them and moved on. I do not know whether this was deliberate. The Enforcement Division's investigation will determine that. I am a clerk. I record what I know and note what I do not. What I know is that on the file's 3rd day, when I began reading rather than only processing, I stopped being the 8th clerk and started being something else. I am not sure what to call that thing. The Commission does not have a standard field for it. The client in this case was a corporate entity I will not name, because naming them is the Enforcement Division's function. What I can record is that the entity had a contract dispute with a survey worker over mineral rights documentation, and that the survey worker possessed certain records that the entity found inconvenient in a way that inconvenient documentation often becomes convenient when the person holding it is no longer available to present it, and that the entity had engaged the Thurvec crew to resolve the inconvenience. The survey worker's name was Dara Salni. She was 29 years old at the time of the events I am recording. She held a Class 3 hydrological survey certification, a secondary certification in geophysical mapping, and a record of 4 years of outer margin contract work with no formal disciplinary history, and what her certification file described as consistently strong field assessment quality, a phrase that the Commission uses on certification reviews when the assessor wants to say the person is excellent, but the form only provides a 5-point scale. She had been working outer margin contracts since her 25th year, which meant she was exactly the kind of person the outer margin tends to accumulate. Skilled and independent and comfortable with environments that are difficult in ways that core world workers are not comfortable with, and not well connected enough that her absence would immediately generate the kind of official attention that might route to an office with more authority than a third-tier clerk's desk. She was also from a world called Heron's Cross. I looked this up because I look up what I do not recognize, and I did not recognize Heron's Cross. The Commission's reference database described it as a colony world in the human territorial cluster, with a population estimate, 3 primary industries, and an environmental classification that I read twice before I was certain I had read it correctly, and then a 3rd time because reading it correctly the first 2 times had not helped me understand it. Heron's Cross was classified as a Class 14 hydrological hazard world. The Commission's environmental classification system, which I know well because I have used it for 19 years, runs from Class 1 benign, suitable for standard biological habitation without technological augmentation, to Class 18, persistently lethal to unaugmented organisms, survival requiring significant technological or physiological adaptation. Class 14 sits well into the portion of the scale that the classification system's architects had intended, as far as I understand it, to describe worlds where nothing should live without serious assistance. The system's formal language for Class 14 is extreme and persistent hydrological hazard conditions requiring specialized physiological or technological adaptation for survival of routine surface operations, with significant mortality risk to standard biological profiles under unaugmented conditions. Heron's Cross was classified Class 14. The organisms that lived there had, over generations of settlement, adapted, or been adapted, or had adapted themselves, which is a distinction I do not have the authority to make, to conditions that the Commission's classification system put near the top of its scale of things that should be avoided by organisms that wanted to remain living organisms. Dara Salni had been born and raised on a Class 14 world. She had, presumably, done what organisms from Class 14 worlds do: survived the Class 14 world long enough to leave it and find other work. The Thurvec crew had dropped her into the Sovath Corridor, which the Commission's public record classified as Category 18, and whose internal working documents classified as Category 20. I sat with this discrepancy for a while. The Thurvec crew's sensor logs covered 41 hours after the drop. I received these logs as part of the file package assembled when the enforcement referral was issued, because Thurvec's billing documentation, submitted to the client as proof of service completion, included the sensor log summary as an appendix. The sensor logs were therefore discoverable and were therefore mine to read. The crew lead had annotated the logs. I want to be precise about this because the annotations matter. They were not automatic instrument outputs. They were the crew lead's own notes, written in his own words, inserted into the log at the timestamps he chose. He annotated when something seemed worth noting. What he found worth noting tells you what he expected to be watching. The first annotation, at 40 minutes after drop, read, "Subject mobile, moving northeast along primary channel shelf, parallel to the main current. Expected trajectory to intersect the main channel within 2 to 3 hours based on visible terrain gradient." He expected her to walk into the river. The river at that section ran at current speeds his own instruments recorded as 22 meters per second. He expected her to walk into it within 2 to 3 hours. The second annotation, at 3 hours and 14 minutes, subject stationary on a basalt shelf, approximately 6 meters above the current waterline. Duration, 40 minutes ongoing. Behavior is inconsistent with expected progression. Standard environmental response at this exposure level is either active transit attempt or immobility consistent with exposure shock. Subject is doing neither. She had found a shelf and stopped moving. She had looked at the river and decided not to walk into it. The third annotation, at 5 hours and 50 minutes, subject resuming movement. Direction, northwest parallel to the channel. This is not a transit attempt toward the channel. Unclear what the subject is doing. He did not understand what she was doing. The annotation has, if I am reading it correctly, and I have read it many times, a quality that I would describe as mild confusion rather than concern. She was not doing what he had seen people do before, but she was in the Sovath Corridor, and the Sovath Corridor's outcome rate was established, and mild confusion about the mechanism seemed, at that stage, like a reasonable response. The fourth annotation, at 9 hours and 3 minutes, subject has constructed a shelter structure on the upper basalt shelf using kit components and natural features. The structure is, I am going to describe this accurately, functional. It addresses the prevailing wind direction and has what appears to be a water collection component. The subject appears to be bivouacking deliberately rather than sheltering in distress. This is unusual. Continue monitoring. She was making camp. She had been in the Sovath Corridor for 9 hours and she was making camp calmly with what he described as a functional structure. The crew lead continued monitoring. The fifth annotation. At 22 hours and 40 minutes, subject active at first light, moving along the shelf in a grid pattern. The spacing between her passes is approximately 3 meters. She appears to be, I am going to use the word surveying because there is no other accurate word, surveying the shelf surface. Continue monitoring. This is outside our standard operational parameters. She was surveying. 22 hours into her time in the Sovath Corridor, with 12 hours of water rations and a disabled beacon, she was conducting a systematic grid survey of the basalt shelf she was standing on. The sixth annotation, at 32 hours. Subject entered a tributary branch at the 17-hour mark. We did not have visibility into the tributary. It runs below our sensor resolution floor at the monitoring altitude, and she was in the tributary for approximately 7 hours. She has now emerged onto a shelf system northwest of the main channel that we cannot fully characterize from this altitude. Thermal signature shows elevated core temperature and indicators consistent with significant physical exertion and probable water immersion. Movement speed has not decreased. This is outside any prior operational data we have for this location. She had gone into a tributary the crew couldn't see into and come out somewhere they hadn't expected her to come out. The seventh annotation at 40 hours and 8 minutes, non-communication threshold reached, classifying operation as proceeding to natural conclusion, withdrawing to transit lane. Note for client. Subject behavior during the monitoring window was atypical in several respects. We do not anticipate this will affect outcome. The Sovath Corridor's outcome rate is established. He was correct that her behavior had been atypical. He was wrong about the outcome. This is the point in the file where the Thervec sensor record ended and the file's next section began. The section I had expected to close the file, which is to say the non-recovery notification. Instead, the file received material from a different direction entirely. The material arrived through Frontier Station 4's intake system on the morning of the 12th day, when a woman walked through the station's main entry on her own feet and asked the duty officer on record for access to the Commission's formal complaint filing system. The duty officer logged her arrival. The intake log, which the duty officer appended to the file as a standard administrative record, described her as presenting with multiple contusions in various stages of healing, moderate abrasion across both forearms and the left shin, signs of significant physical exertion and probable prolonged exposure, and a field kit that appeared to have been extensively modified from its original configuration. She declined medical assessment. She filed the complaint. Then she submitted a 34-page hydrological survey document. Both of these things came to me, along with the intake log, as part of the file package. I read them in the order they arrived, which meant I read the complaint first and the survey document second and Dara Salna's field journal third, because the journal was submitted as an evidentiary attachment to the complaint, and I did not realize what it was until I had already processed the complaint's formal citations. The complaint named the Thervec crew by vessel registration and crew lead identification. It named the client entity. It cited 11 specific regulatory violations across 4 commission codes, cited correctly and in the correct order of ascending severity, which told me that whoever had written it had either legal training or, the more I read, the more I came to believe this, the kind of systematic mind that, when it decides to file a complaint, reads the relevant codes first and cites them properly. She cited them from memory or from handwritten notes. She had not had access to a commission terminal. Then I read the survey document. The survey document was filed under her Class 3 hydrological certification number as a standard Class 3 field survey submission. It covered the secondary shelf system she had identified and traversed, with detailed characterizations of the hydrological anomalies she had observed, the mineral strata she had assessed, the internal drainage channels she had identified by observation of runoff patterns, and a full transit characterization of the corridor section she had passed through, including 3 sections that the Commission's own prior surveys had flagged as untransitable. She had transited all three. She had described exactly how. The survey document proposed a reclassification of the Sovath Corridor from Category 18 to Category 22, based on her revised assessment of the internal drainage system's behavior during the wet season and the implications of that behavior for the Commission's prior flow rate models. The Commission's own internal documents had assessed the corridor at Category 20. Dara Salni had walked through it in 11 days and determined it was worse than that. She submitted it as a Class 3 hydrological filing. She noted that some measurements were estimated rather than directly instrumented due to non-standard survey conditions, and that she would welcome the opportunity to return with proper equipment to confirm the estimates. Return. She was proposing to go back to the Sovath Corridor. Then I read the journal. The journal was a field notebook, standard Commission issue. Its covers waterproofed with a treatment that I believe she had applied herself. The duty officer's intake log noted that several items in her kit had been modified from original configuration, and I think this was one of them. The journal had been kept in a sealed kit compartment. It was legible throughout, which, given the 11 days it had spent inside the Sovath Corridor, was not something I had expected. I have read distress logs before. I have processed 8 of them in my career, recovered from expeditions that did not fully succeed in what they set out to do. I know what a distress log looks like. It begins as a document, plans, observations, rational progression, and it changes. The entries short. The subject matter narrows. The handwriting shifts. The gaps between entries grow and then the entries stop, and the gap at the end is the thing that tells you how the story concluded. A distress log is a document that loses its argument with the environment incrementally, and the losing is visible on the page. Dara Salni's journal did not look like that. The first entry was dated to the first night, several hours after the drop. It was a site characterization. Water temperature at the channel edge, she had measured it directly, by means she described in 2 words I interpreted as a technique rather than improvisation. Estimated current speed, measured against a debris piece she had marked and timed. Visible geological strata described in the vocabulary of her certification. Formation type, approximate age, weathering pattern, fracture density. The composition of the basalt shelf she was bivouacking on, with a note about its load-bearing properties at the edge. And at the end of the first entry, in the same handwriting and the same tone as everything preceding it, 1 line. Beacon non-functional. Rations for approximately 12 hours. Assess egress options at first light. That was the entirety of the journal's engagement with what I would have called the crisis. 1 line, and then first light. First light, assess egress options, not escape. Egress. The precise word for a planned route out of a confined space, as opposed to the imprecise panic of someone trying to leave a dangerous place as fast as possible. The second entry described the tributary branch. She had entered it using a technique she described in 6 lines of notation that I read 3 times and partially understood, and which a hydrological consultant later described to me as a whitewater transit technique used by specialists on high-gradient rivers, adapted for a solo entry without a safety line. She spent 7 hours inside the tributary. She found the secondary shelf system, which she had deduced existed from the visible strata at the tributary's entrance. She had seen the geological signature of a shelf formation in the rock and followed it. The Commission had not known the secondary shelf system existed. She had found it by reading the rock. Her left shoulder had been dislocated during the tributary entry. She noted this in a parenthetical. 3 words and then a description of the reduction which she had performed herself, which was 4 more words. Then the entry returned to the shelf system. I want to be careful about how I describe the next several days. Because the journal's character is difficult to render accurately in the summary language that filing requires. The journal is not dramatic. That is the thing that is hardest to convey. A person alone in a Category 20 system for 11 days, with no reliable food source and a disabled beacon and injuries accumulating across the transit, could be expected to produce a document with a certain kind of urgency. The urgency would be understandable. I would not have found it unusual. The journal is not urgent. It is thorough. Day 3's entry covered more ground on the secondary shelf system and was longer than Day 2's because there was more to record. She had found and characterized 3 additional hydrological anomalies, places where the water moved through the basalt in ways the surface indicated, but the Commission's models had not accounted for. She described them in technical language that I looked up where I could and noted as specialist vocabulary where I could not. She estimated their dimensions by reference to her own body, which she used as a measuring instrument in the absence of instrumented tools, and she noted the margin of error in those estimates, which was an appropriate and professionally correct thing to do. She was conducting a survey. She was conducting it alone, in a Category 20 gorge, on her 3rd day without a food source, and she was being professionally correct about her margin of error. Day 4 she fell. I know she fell because she noted it. The entry begins with a notation about her left knee, which had sustained a significant impact against the basalt shelf during a pre-dawn transit maneuver. She describes the impact. She notes that the knee is functional with reduced range, and that she is adjusting her transit technique to reduce rotational load on the joint. The adjustment is described in 2 sentences. The entry continues with the day's survey observations. The knee notation is 4 lines long. I read it, and then I went back and read the Thurvik crew lead's annotation. The Sovath Corridor's outcome rate is established. And I held those 2 documents next to each other in my mind for a time that was not, strictly speaking, part of my working process. A clerk's job is to read sequentially and file accurately, not to sit with things. I sat with those 2 things. Day 5 was the rain. The Sovath Corridor receives, in its wet season, precipitation that the Commission's meteorological instruments record in aggregate terms, and the aggregate is significant. Day 5 of Dara Salna's transit coincided with the kind of rainfall event that the Commission's assessors, in their survey notes, had described as the principal cause of catastrophic condition changes in the corridor interior. The rain she described in her journal was not a background condition. It was an active change to the environment she was navigating. It raised the waterline, altered the surface character of the basalt shelf, changed the drainage patterns of the secondary shelf system, and compressed her available transit surface. Day 5's entry is the longest in the journal. Not because she was frightened, not because anything had gone wrong in a way she was not managing, because there was more data. She spent the rain day documenting. She had marked a reference point on the basalt below the waterline at the start of the rain, and was timing the waterline's rise against her chronometer. She had, and I am now going to describe something that I looked up and confirmed was technically significant, identified 3 locations on the secondary shelf system where the runoff pattern indicated internal drainage channels within the basalt itself, channels that would account for a flow rate disparity that the Commission's hydrological team had documented in their prior survey data and had been unable to explain for 11 years. The disparity was a known anomaly in the Commission's model. She identified its source on day 5 of her transit, with no instruments, from observation of surface water behavior in a rain event, while sitting on a shelf in the Sovath Corridor. She also found food. She described them as shelf invertebrates, small, class II approximation by morphology, determined edible by preparation. The preparation she described in detail because she was thorough, and it required 40 minutes and materials from her kit. She did not describe whether the result was pleasant. It was not information she considered relevant. She had determined they were edible. That was the relevant finding. She recorded it and moved on. Day 6. Day 7. The pattern had been established, and what varies across those entries is the accumulation of detail rather than the character of the record. She was moving northwest along the secondary shelf system, mapping as she went, her pace steady at the rate she had established in the earlier days. Her knee was improving on the schedule she had projected. Her shoulder, which she checked in each entry with a brief notation on its functional status, had returned to what she described as 90% of normal function, which she rated as adequate for the transit conditions. On day 7, she encountered a section of the corridor that the Commission's prior surveys had flagged as untransitable, a place where the secondary shelf system narrowed to a point at which it was no longer navigable by any surface transit method the Commission's teams had used, and where the main channel's current speed and depth made a water transit impossible for standard biological profiles. She described the section in the careful language she used for all difficult problems: the visible geometry, the water behavior, the basalt surface condition, the available hold points, and the technique she was going to use. The technique she described used the water, not against it, with it, in a way that treated the current as a tool rather than an obstacle. She described it in enough technical detail that the Commission's hydrological consultant, when I described the section to him, said she had done something his team had specifically determined was not achievable with their equipment and protocols. I noted his assessment. Day 8's entry is the shortest in the journal. I want to describe it carefully, because it is the entry I have read more times than any other single document in my career. It is 7 lines. The first 3 lines complete a transit assessment she had begun at the end of Day 7's entry, a calculation of her current position and remaining distance to the lower drainage mouth, based on the corridor geometry she had been mapping. The calculation is precise, with correctly identified uncertainties. The 4th line reads, shoulder at full function. The 5th line reads, Day 8, 11 days egress estimate from drop point baseline Day 1. Current position suggests this estimate was conservative. She had projected her own egress timeline at the beginning of the transit. She was ahead of it. The 6th line reads, this is a significant gorge. The 7th line reads, they should have sent a survey team. That is the complete entry. I have read it many times trying to find what I expected to find: the fear, or the bitterness, or the desperation, or the anger. The entry does not contain them. It contains an accurate statement about the gorge's character. Significant is the correct word, and she was using it correctly in the sense that a hydrological surveyor uses it, to mean a system of consequence and complexity that warrants serious attention, and a professional observation about how the Commission should have treated it. They should have sent a survey team. Not they tried to kill me and should have known better. Not, I should not be here. Those would have been true statements and she could have written them. She wrote instead an assessment of the Commission's prior failure to properly resource the survey of a significant system, which was also a true statement, and was, under the circumstances, the kind of statement that I find myself returning to when I am trying to understand what kind of person walks out of the Sovath Corridor in 11 days and files a hydrological survey. The kind of person who looks at the Sovath Corridor and thinks, this should have been studied properly. Days 9 and 10. The shelf system widened again on Day 9, consistent with her geological prediction based on the formation character she had been reading since Day 3. The waterline had stabilized after the rain, also as she had predicted. Her egress timeline was holding. On Day 10, she climbed a basalt formation she described as approximately 22 meters, moderate technical difficulty, holds adequate to gain a vantage point over the corridor's lower reaches, and confirmed that the drainage mouth was visible and accessible from her position, within approximately 16 hours of transit at her current pace. She noted the 16-hour estimate. She also noted that her current pace would bring her to the drainage mouth in 12 hours. She took 11. Day 11's entry was a single line. It read, drainage mouth reached, beacon assembled from kit components and recovered material, signal activated, will walk to the frontier station. She built a beacon out of the remains of her field kit and things she had collected in the gorge. I later confirmed with the Commission's communications technician that this was possible, and that a person who knew what they were doing could assemble a short-range locator beacon from standard kit components, and that the word and recovered material in her notation likely referred to conductive elements from the basalt shelf formation, which contain mineral deposits sufficient to augment a low-power signal. The technician said this as a statement of fact. Then he paused and said that knowing how to do it was a non-trivial thing. She activated the beacon before she walked to the station. She did not activate it to call for rescue. She activated it so that the Commission's traffic monitoring system would register an active signal at the lower drainage mouth and log it, which would mean that, when she arrived at the station and filed her documents, the beacon log would already be in the system, and there would be no question about when she had emerged from the corridor. The record would be clean. A clerk's instinct. She then walked to Frontier Station 4. The intake log recorded her arrival at 9:14 on day 12. She had walked from the drainage mouth to the station on her own feet, across the lower gorge approach terrain, which the Commission's maps described as difficult non-standard transit conditions. She arrived. She declined medical assessment. She filed the complaint. She submitted the survey document. I assembled the file from those materials plus the Thervix sensor logs, the contract record, the corridor's historical case files, and the Commission's prior internal assessment documents, including the discrepancy between the public Category 18 and the internal Category 20 designations. I prepared the background section. I submitted the enforcement referral. Then I reached the classification field. The classification field has 12 standard entries. I know them all. They cover the range of incidents that the Commission's architects, when they designed the classification system, believed a Commission file might need to describe. They had not anticipated a file in which a person was placed in a Category 20 system by a private contractor operating under false contract terms, survived 11 days in that system without assistance, produced a hydrological survey that revised the system's hazard classification upward, filed a correctly cited regulatory complaint naming her alleged perpetrators and their client, and submitted a return survey proposal. None of the 12 entries fit. I used the closest one. I noted in the record that the classification was approximate and that a supplementary remarks notation would follow. What I wrote in the supplementary remarks field, the field that third-tier clerks are permitted to use for contextual information that the standard fields do not cover, was: subject recovered, evidentiary documentation complete, enforcement referral issued under case reference withheld pending proceedings, survey documentation filed under Class 3 certification for Commission hydrological review, file status, closed pending enforcement outcome. Standard language, the form was filled correctly, the file was accurate. I then wrote one additional line below the standard language in the supplementary remarks field's continuation space, which exists for cases where the standard space is insufficient. I wrote, in the Vehn Territorial Survey Commission's 32-year record of the Sovath Hydrological Corridor, this is the only closed file containing a returned survey proposal. The proposing party's certification number is noted above. Then I closed the file. The Commission's hydrological consultant submitted his preliminary assessment of the survey document 17 days later. It was 41 pages long. In 19 years, I have never received a consultant's assessment longer than 12 pages, 41 pages. He confirmed 9 of her 11 anomaly identifications as accurate. He proposed further study on the remaining 2. He endorsed her Category 22 reclassification recommendation, a designation 2 steps above the Commission's own working classification of Category 20, on the grounds that her characterization of the internal drainage system resolved the flow rate disparity his team had been unable to explain for 11 years. He also included, in the final paragraph of his assessment, outside the formal recommendation section, in language that was not standard consultant language, and that I think he included because he was not, at that point, writing as a consultant but as something else. A note that he would like to accompany the follow-up survey team when it was organized. I noted his interest. The enforcement proceeding is ongoing. I am not the clerk for that file. What I know is that the Thurvec crew lead was interviewed by the enforcement division, and that during the interview he was shown the field journal, the sensor logs, and the survey document together, and that the interviewing officer's clerk, who processes their interview records, mentioned to me, in passing, that there had been a period of silence in the interview room after the crew lead had finished reading, that the officer had logged as approximately 4 minutes. I have thought about those 4 minutes. The crew lead had built his operational model on the Sovath corridor's established outcome rate. He had been correct about 31 expeditions. He had watched Dara Salna's sensor trace for 41 hours and annotated his confusion at each deviation from his model, and he had concluded at the threshold that the deviations were interesting but not consequential, because the corridor was the corridor and the corridor's rate was established. He withdrew to the transit lane. He issued his completion notification. He was wrong once. He needed 4 minutes to be wrong once. The follow-up survey of the Sovath Hydrological Corridor was approved by the Regional Directorate 6 weeks after the enforcement referral and organized with Dara Salna's field survey as the foundational planning document. She accepted the lead hydrological surveyor position on the team. The offer letter, which was copied to the file as a standard administrative record, was in the Commission's standard phrasing. Someone in the Regional Directorate's office had added a handwritten note at the bottom of the Commission's copy. The note was unsigned and not addressed to anyone in particular. I should not have included it in the official file. I included it in the official file. The note said, "She already knows that gorge better than we do." I agree with the note. I want to add something to this record that is not, strictly speaking, required by the Commission's filing protocols. The Commission's protocols require accuracy and completeness within the standard fields. They do not require reflection. Reflection is outside my function, and I am aware of that. And I am going to do it anyway because I believe the file warrants it, and because I have been a third-tier clerk for 19 years, and I have never once done anything that was outside my function. And I think the function has, in this case, its limits. The thing I want to add concerns the Thurvec crew lead's understanding of what he was dealing with when he dropped Dara Salna into the Sovath corridor. He was not a foolish person. I want to be clear about that. His operational model was sophisticated. It was built on real data, 31 expeditions worth of real data across 42 years, accumulated by the Sovath corridor against every kind of expedition the outer margin could produce. Scientific survey teams, commercial extraction crews, adventure contractors, individuals with no sponsoring entity, and presumably a variety of levels of skill and preparation. The corridor consumed all of them. The corridor consumed them consistently, without apparent preference for the well-prepared over the poorly prepared, the experienced over the inexperienced, the well-equipped over the lightly equipped. It consumed 6 Commission-sanctioned scientific surveys. 6. These were not unprepared people. These were professionals with institutional support and proper equipment and the Commission's organizational resources behind them. The corridor consumed them, along with everyone else. Against that data, the Thurvec crew lead had built an outcome rate. The outcome rate was correct. It was correct for everything it had been tested against. He did not know that the range of things it had been tested against had a ceiling. I looked up Heron's Cross more carefully, after I had read the journal and assembled the file, because I am a clerk and I look up what I do not fully understand, and I did not fully understand what it meant to be from Heron's Cross in the context of 11 days in the Sovath corridor. The Commission's reference database gave me the 4 lines I mentioned earlier. I then pulled the Commission's full environmental assessment file for the Human Territorial Cluster, which is a document I had never needed to consult before, because the Human Territorial Cluster does not often generate files that reach my desk. The full assessment described Heron's Cross in 26 pages. 26 pages to describe a world. Most colony worlds receive 2 to 4 pages in the Commission's full assessment archive. Worlds that receive 26 pages are worlds that required extensive assessment because the assessment team kept finding things they had not expected to find, and then kept finding implications of those things, and then kept finding implications of the implications. Heron's Cross received 26 pages because the assessment lead had written in his introduction, "The hydrological systems of Heron's Cross present a complexity and lethality profile that does not map cleanly onto the Commission's standard environmental assessment framework." The standard framework, which runs to the Class 18 ceiling, had been designed around what the Commission's founders considered the practical range of environments that biological organisms might need to navigate. They had apparently not fully anticipated Heron's Cross. The assessment team had classified it at Class 14, which was near the top of the scale, and then noted in the supplementary assessment section that the classification was conservative relative to the wet season hazard profile, which is a way of saying the number was as high as the scale went while still being a number, and the actual conditions during the wet season were a thing the scale's number had to approximate rather than precisely represent. The organisms that had settled Heron's Cross, humans, who had been settling difficult worlds for as long as they had been settling worlds, in the way that organisms from a Class 12 plus origin world often do, which is to say with a practical orientation toward difficulty that other species sometimes mistake for optimism, had adapted to it. Not quickly, in the evolutionary sense, but in the generational sense that cultural and physiological adaptation can operate. Practices and techniques and capacities that a person born on Heron's Cross would acquire through the simple process of growing up there, in the way that a person born anywhere acquires what the place requires of them to survive it. Dara Salni had grown up on Heron's Cross. She had grown up on a Class 14 hydrological hazard world where the wet season's conditions required, as the Commission's full assessment described it, persistent application of specialized transit and survival techniques adapted to high-energy water systems, irregular surface morphology, and rapid environmental change. The assessment gave examples. I read the examples. The examples described conditions that were, in several respects, more demanding than the Sovath Corridor. The Sovath Corridor was, by the Commission's internal working classification, Category 20. Heron's Cross was, by the Commission's external published classification, Class 14, and the external classification was described, in the assessment's supplementary section, as conservative for the wet season. I am a clerk. I do not draw conclusions. I record what the data shows. The data showed that the Thurvec crew lead had taken a person who had grown up navigating conditions more difficult than the Sovath Corridor, and dropped her into the Sovath Corridor with 12 hours of rations and a disabled beacon, and that his operational model had not included this variable, because the variable had never come up before. In 31 expeditions across 42 years, the corridor had not received a person from a Class 14 hydrological hazard world. It had received people from Class 2 worlds and Class 4 worlds and Class 6 worlds, and presumably, some world that produced the kind of person who books an adventure contractor and pays for the experience of a lethal environment and trusts that the management means something. It had not received Heron's Cross. The crew lead's outcome rate was established for everything the corridor had ever processed. It was not established for Dara Salni. I have thought about the word established. I have thought about it in the context of the crew lead's annotation. The Sovath Corridor's outcome rate is established, which he wrote as a confident thing. the kind of confident annotation that a person writes when they are reporting a fact rather than offering an opinion. He was reporting a fact. The fact was accurate for the domain in which it had been established. The domain did not include her. This is not a comfort, exactly. It does not make the 31 prior expeditions less lost, or make the Commission's internal Category 20 designation and public Category 18 designation any less of an institutional decision I have noted with precise citations. It does not make the Thurvec crew leads 11 prior operations any less of a pattern that 7 clerks across 4 regional offices did not connect into a picture. But it does explain, in a way that I find useful for the purposes of understanding what the file records, why the crew lead needed 4 minutes when the interviewing officer showed him the journal. He had built his model on everything he knew. Everything he knew was correct, and then it was not. 4 minutes seems, under those circumstances, like a reasonable amount of time to sit with that. The Commission's reclassification of the Sovath Corridor from Category 18 to Category 22. The Category 22 that Dara Salna's survey document had recommended, 2 steps above the internal working classification of Category 20, that the Commission had itself suppressed from the public record, was formally approved 91 days after the enforcement referral was issued. The approval notice was copied to the file as a standard administrative record. It cited her survey document as the primary basis for the reclassification recommendation. I am going to note something about that reclassification that is not required by the standard filing protocols, and that I am nodding anyway. The Commission had classified the corridor at Category 18 publicly and Category 20 internally. The Category 20 internal classification was the result of 18 expeditions worth of data assembled by the Commission's own recovery teams, and it was suppressed because correcting the public record would have required explaining the delay. The Category 22 reclassification that corrected both the public and internal records was generated by one person, in 11 days, without instruments, without institutional support, and in conditions that the Commission's own assessment language described as incompatible with standard biological transit. She revised the Commission's understanding of the Sovath Corridor upward in the direction of greater accuracy, from inside the Sovath Corridor, while the Commission's own assessment team had been unwilling to send personnel into the corridor to assess it directly for 7 years. Her survey document also, as I noted, resolved the flow rate disparity that the Commission's hydrological team had been unable to explain for 11 years. The Commission's hydrological consultant, in his 41-page assessment, described the resolution as a straightforward inference from the surface runoff patterns at the 3 anomaly sites, once the internal drainage channel network is understood. He then added that understanding the internal drainage channel network had required access to the surface runoff patterns during a precipitation event, which had required being inside the corridor during the rain. Nobody had been inside the corridor during the rain before, because the corridor did not allow that. It had not allowed it for 31 expeditions. It had allowed it for 1, and 1 had been sufficient to resolve 11 years of model uncertainty, identify a drainage network the Commission had not known existed, and produce 34 pages of survey data that the Commission's own teams had determined was not obtainable. I filed the reclassification notice. I noted the citation to her survey document. I appended the hydrological consultant's assessment summary to the file's reference section. Then the file received one more piece of material, which arrived 43 days after the reclassification approval and which I had not expected to receive, because it was not a standard Commission document and was not part of any standard filing procedure, and I received it only because the Commission Certification Office routed it to the file as a reference attachment when they processed the relevant administrative action. The material was a certification upgrade notification. Dara Salna's Class 3 Hydrological Survey certification had been reviewed, apparently at the initiative of the Commission's Certification Board, on the recommendation of the hydrological consultant, and upgraded to Class 1, which is the Commission's highest field certification for hydrological survey work, the certification that the Commission awards to practitioners whose demonstrated assessment capability exceeds the standard Class 3 threshold by a qualifying margin. The qualifying margin, in the Certification Board's language, is defined as a level of field assessment accuracy, methodological rigor, and environmental characterization that would be expected of an experienced Class 1 practitioner under standard survey conditions. The Board's determination letter noted, in its justification section, that the submitted survey document demonstrated assessment capability consistent with the Class 1 standard, conducted under conditions that substantially exceeded the difficulty parameters of standard Class 1 survey operations. She had been certified Class 3 when she entered the Sovath Corridor. She came out with data that earned her Class 1. The Board's determination letter also included a line in its final paragraph that was not standard certification language. The line said, "The Board notes that the survey methodology described in the attached field journal represents a practical approach to high-hazard hydrological assessment that the Commission's current survey training protocols do not fully address, and recommends that the Commission's Survey Training Division review the attached field journal for potential incorporation into advanced survey curriculum." They wanted to teach her methods. The methods she had developed or applied, or refined from what Heron's Cross had given her, which is a distinction I am not qualified to make, in 11 days in the Sovath Corridor, alone, with a disabled beacon and 12 hours of rations, and a dislocated shoulder, and a damaged knee, and no institutional support, and an operational ceiling that the Thurvec crew lead had been confident was final. Those methods. I appended the certification upgrade notification to the file. I appended the Board's determination letter. I noted the recommendation regarding the Survey Training Division. Then the file was complete. The file was complete in the sense that all the material was present and all the standard fields were filled, and all the necessary referrals and notifications and administrative actions were recorded and routed. The file was, in the Commission's technical sense, done. I am Keth Avin, third-tier archival clerk of the Vehn Territorial Survey Commission, and I have kept this file for longer than any other file in my career, not because it was procedurally incomplete. It was complete very early by the Commission's standards, but because I found that after I had closed it, I kept returning to it. I kept returning to the 7th line of Day 8's journal entry. They should have sent a survey team. I have a theory about that line, which is not the kind of thing a clerk is supposed to have, but I have been having it for some time now, and it seems unlikely to stop, so I will put it in the record in the supplementary remarks space and let whoever reads this make of it what they can. My theory is that the line is not about the Commission's failure to properly resource the survey of a significant hydrological system, although it is also about that. My theory is that it is about something more fundamental, which is the question of what you can know about a place if you have only ever looked at it from outside. The Commission had assessed the Sovath Corridor from the outside. The assessment team had not entered the corridor. Their field notes said this explicitly. Direct assessment of the corridor interior is not feasible under current operational parameters. They had instrumented it from above and from the margins. They had read the data their instruments produced. They had classified it at Category 18, and they had been wrong. And later they had reclassified it internally to Category 20, and they had still been wrong, and in both cases they had been wrong in the same direction. They had underestimated it, because they had been outside it. Darasalny had been inside it. Inside it, with no instruments except her certification knowledge and her own body, and the techniques that a Class 14 world gives to the people who grow up on it. She had read the corridor more accurately in 11 days than the Commission had managed in 42 years of external assessment. They should have sent a survey team. Not to rescue her, not as a reflection on her own situation, as a professional observation about the methodology problem. The corridor was significant. It warranted proper attention. The proper attention had not been provided. She had been inside it long enough to know exactly how significant it was and exactly how inadequate the prior attention had been, and she recorded this in the same flat, accurate, professional tone she used for everything else in the journal. The gorge had earned the word significant. She gave it the word. She gave it precisely the word it had earned, and then she kept walking. I closed the file. The file is the 32nd in the corridor's documented history. It is the only one I have been asked about since.